All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I am your host, Dr. D. Today we are talking about a preparedness opportunity. Canada being on the cusp of an incredible potential change in preparedness. Sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverages. Let's get at her. All right, welcome back, and thanks again for joining us here at Inside My Canoe Head, and thank you very much for many of you who are continuing to provide us some great insight into how you consume what you would prefer and comments about our episodes. And I want to highlight a couple that came in relation to our previous episode, the episode on your preparedness superpower, geared around your physical, financial, and mental health being the keys to your success, based upon the Stoic philosophy of controlling what you can, improving what you can, and better preparing and readying yourself for dealing for things you cannot control, those exogenous shocks and outside. Now, thank you for the compliments, but I really want to highlight a couple of the notes that challenged my idea about the fact that this is within your control and that some people are in precarious positions. Let me be clear. There are people in any number of positions, and I said clearly throughout the episode, and I continue to believe wholeheartedly, you are where you are today. It is what it is. You accept it as is where is. You don't blame anything for why you got there, but you first understand that I will not improve. My life condition will not improve unless I decide to do something about it. And I've spoken about the fact that all of these changes are longitudinal. None of it happens overnight. What happens overnight, though, is you looking that incredible person in the mirror and saying, hey, you know what? This is not the way I want to continue existing anymore. I want to improve my physical, my financial, and my mental health so that I'm better prepared to assist myself and those for whom I'm responsible when the shizzy hits the fizzy, right? That decision is up to you. You have an active choice to look at that incredible person in the mirror and choose to assume responsibility and start to make changes, or you can look at that incredible person in the mirror and choose to be a victim. Buy into the tagline of the Euro Press that it's somebody else's fault, that the system is preventing you from being successful. You can come up with, if you're really trying hard enough, you can come up with a myriad and laundry list of excuses why you can't turn your life around. I'm just suggesting if you took a quarter of the effort you're going in to describe how somebody is oppressing you, and you take a quarter of that effort into changing your own life that's within your control, I'm going to suggest to you that your outcomes would be better, right? It has to start with you looking yourself in the mirror and saying, you know what? I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel ready for those punches upside the head that life can throw, and I would like to do something about it. That's simply what it's meant. If you choose, and I've said this all along, if you choose that you want to adopt the victim mentality, that your life is the way it is because of somebody else's fault, and that you are being blocked or prevented from improving your condition, then you have every legal right and moral right to do that. You have yourself a great day. There's nothing I or anybody else in the world can do for you, right? You're on your own. You want to play victim, have yourself a great day. But if you want to change, that's where preparedness can help you. So hopefully that clarifies exactly what I meant for those of you who don't. If you still disagree with me, please feel free to continue. Send in notes. Tell me why. And we can have that discourse online. Remember, I'm the one calling for we need to have more open, honest, and frank discourse about the state of preparedness in society and a culture of preparedness or the lack thereof that leads us to community resilience. We don't have a culture of preparedness, and we need one. And I've written a bunch about it this week. Check our blogs over at preparednesslabs.ca. They're free of charge. I won't know you're there. You don't have to leave your email or anything. There's well over 100 of them. And there's close to 300 episodes of this podcast. Welcome to the second last episode of Season 11 here at Inside My Canoe Head. We're closing up this season. The last episode will be out on Friday. And then the podcast is going to take a short period break, probably about 10 days, a week to 10 days. I myself am going to be under the weather and not available for that period of time. I'm having one of those old procedures done that happens to old men every once in a while. 53 is not old, but every once in a while you have to go under the knife. So I'll be under the knife and in the hospital for a while. When I come out of the other end of that sucker, we're going to launch season 12. We got some great plans. I got some great ideas. I got a couple of really cool guests lined up to do some periodic interviews. And for those of you that are not familiar, new to joining us here at Inside My Canoe Head, this format you're listening to right now is the vast majority of our episodes are me discussing issues as they exist in frame of reference to preparedness, talking about real world, talking about things that you can do, providing examples, etc. Periodically, we do have guests to talk in, but this podcast is not grounded in guest interviews. Some people prefer that. Some people don't. That's perfectly fine. I do periodic interviews, but I don't do a great deal of them. I find talking about issues like this and giving feedback directly to individuals on the other end is a lot of fun. And it actually, I think, is doing fairly well. So we want to talk today about Canada's upcoming opportunity, an incredible opportunity. I think this country is for a bunch of series of events that are intersecting at this point in time in 2024 that are providing a unique and important opportunity to reflect upon. And the first thing that's a note of that is the Canadian Emergency Preparedness and Climate Adaptation Expo that is happening over this week here in my home city of Ottawa from the 24th, 25th, and 26th. The conference itself is the last 2 days. The first day is an invite-only series of workshops on different topics. I'm in a workshop on the 24th, which is tomorrow, on the use of the Canadian Armed Forces in domestic disaster response and what can we do to help facilitate the provinces and territories to put them in a better position where they're less likely to call on the military to conduct disaster response and aid to civil power operations. So that's the first day. On the next couple of days, there's over 2,000 delegates. There's close to 100 speakers. I'm on a panel on the Thursday with the former head of FEMA, Brock Long, and some other really incredible people. Tim Riker, the contrarian emergency manager, is going to be on this panel as well. Eva Cohen is talking, is a leading voice for community resilience and the THW preparedness system that exists in Germany and bringing that to Canada. And as well, we've got moderated by Jim Montgomery, who's the founder and the head of Canadian Disaster Response Organization. So we're answering and addressing the question, does Canada need a civilian disaster response capability? Right? Do we need it? What does it look like, et cetera? Great panel. But we're one of about 10 panels that day that are going to tackle some pretty significant issues. And I'm a big fan of conventions, not just because there's a lot of schmoozing and handshaking going on, but because it's where we can have these really, really important, impactful discussions with leading voices in the field, right? It's a lot of times we banter back and forth, most of it civilly, not all of it. I mean, there is an increasing hostility even on LinkedIn, but most of the time, these are one-off opportunities to get a really grump of really dedicated and focused minds together to look at an issue, to look at a question or problem within the bigger field and genre of emergency management, emergency preparedness, climate change, climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and all of these intersecting ideas are all being talked about at the upcoming conference this week. So, it's $1,500, $1,500 a person. It's not cheap, but there's over 2,000 people. I mean, there is a concerted effort, and we're realizing that in Canada that we have an opportunity in front of us to do something pretty incredible when it comes to preparedness in this country. The question is as to whether we can figure out what that is and that we can get the right and correct minds together to come up with something that will answer the question and is actually possible to implement across our unique constitutional system here in this country. So this is a great opportunity. They don't come that often. Please pay attention to emergencyexpo.com is a website for the conference, and just link in it and follow it on LinkedIn, because I know there's going to be a lot of fallout material presentation material, discussion material, and a lot of great ideas are going to come out of it, because this is a great collision event, as I like to refer to them. It's where a lot of really, really passionate individuals come together from all different frames. When I mean about a frame, we can look at the state of preparedness in this country, but we can look at it from a period of, if you're an advocate for the vulnerable and marginalized population of Canada, and you look at preparedness, you look at it through a certain lens, right? If you're you've heard the phrase trauma-informed lens. That means that as you're examining a problem or a question of the day, you're doing it looking at it through a lens that includes the experience of people who have suffered trauma, and how they might experience the phenomenon differently, or how they may look for solutions to the phenomena or the experience differently than maybe Joe Q average or Jane Q average public, right? So informed lenses are important. And this is really thing, because we have everybody here from nature-based solutions to the oil and gas industry to the forestry industry. These are big, important players in the country, and we need to get everybody around the table. So this conference is an incredible opportunity. And what it really gives us the chance to do is sit back and have that frank discussion about what is the role of emergency management in Canadian society. And I say Canadian because I'm speaking to my own country, but insert German, insert United Kingdom, insert whatever country you're from or wherever country you happen to be living now. What is the role of emergency management in the country? And it's going to look very much differently depending on where you are. And I've written extensively, and I'm not going to hammer away at the points here, but basically we have gone from a culture of independence to a culture of dependency on government in Canada. And it's very familiar in a lot of other Western countries, where when we have a societal problem creeps up, the first thing by default we look to is we must need a government intervention. The government must come solve this issue. We don't say, hey, listen, this issue is the community's to solve first and foremost. Give the community the time and space to solve it on its own. If they're unsuccessful, you may need the support, and in rare cases, the intervention of government to solve an issue. That's what the frame used to be. Now the frame is immediately turned to government. And one of the great thinkers in the emergency management field in the United States is a gentleman by the name of Damon Coppola. And he wrote the Introduction to International Disaster Management textbooks. He's a co-contributor on many other textbooks. He works in a number of firms in the Western United States looking at community resilience and insurance issues, risk management, risk identification, and just a brilliant, absolute brilliant mind. And he came up with a rough quote, and I'm going to paraphrase him here, is that in an idea, when we know we've got it right, community resilience means that emergency management is the redundancy, which means for the most part, whatever occurs is going to be managed by the community, the resilient community, through its own efforts, and the redundancy, if extra assistance is necessary, will be provided by emergency management, not the other way around, right? This is what I mean about the role of EM, and figuring out what the role of emergency management in society is very, very important to identify clearly up front. Because as we then take a step back and start tackling individual problems, we need to understand the goal that we're working towards. I argue, and Brock Long, that former head of FEMA, put this in the best sense, that we need a culture of preparedness in this country, right? A culture of preparedness means that individuals see themselves as responsible for their outcomes, not as individual in people and family units, but as a community, and that they understand that when bad things happen, it's the community's responsibility to help the community out. And then if necessary, on rare or off occasions, if they need extra support, they can always lean on some type of government agency. That's kind of what we're looking for. And the way emergency management works in Canada, for a bit of a history, emergency management is generally It's a shared responsibility under our Constitution Act of 1982. It simply means that there is no one level of government who holds a higher level of authority in emergency management. So we don't have a parent-child relationship between the federal and the provinces or territories. So, for example, the federal government doesn't have the power to come in and impose a solution for emergency management, right? So, for example, if you wanted a common standard of the definition of the word preparedness, that can't be imposed by the federal government. It would have to be agreed upon between the federal government and the provinces. So this is the kind, we call it cooperative federalism because it means within the Constitution when it was signed, and it's never been updated. Constitutional conferences scare the heck out of people in this country. But if it's not clearly defined in the Constitution as a sole power of the federal government or a sole power of the provincial government, we get into a situation where everything else falls into what we call cooperative federalism. And that means that everybody has to get together to figure out a common solution that includes the interests and the needs of everybody at the table. Almost like consensus, but not absolutely always 100% consensus. So I will sit here and defend in the nation of Canada, our FPT, our federal, provincial, and territorial governance system for emergency management works very well. We have a reasonably ideal structure. We don't suffer from a failure of structure in this country. We don't suffer from a failure of governance and emergency management. And I'll say this one phrase over and over again. Emergency management in Canada does not suffer from a lack of bureaucracy. If the provinces, if the FPT agreements and the FPT meetings, which happen several times a year between all the appropriate and necessary people, if they fail to reach an agreement, that is a function of the humans in the room. It is not a function of the governance structure. So I want to be clear, and this is an argument I'll make at the panel on Thursday at the conference, is that we don't suffer a problem with our governance structure. We don't suffer with a roadmap to consensus outcomes and agreeing on policy. We don't agree on policy. There's a number of interventions. There's political interventions. There's ideological interventions. But I just want to say that we have to be very, very careful about prescribing solutions. And I've called about this in my writing before. We have something called a policy entrepreneur. And you've seen them. These are people who tell you what we need in the country. You know, we need a new directorate of this who will be able to make these rules and enforce it on the provinces. You often hear that for people who are opposed to certain premiers in this country. They always turn to look, I want the federal government to just come in and impose on them and tell them what to do so that I get it done the way I think it should be done. Those people are called policy entrepreneurs. They have a very well-defined outcome. They've probably written draft legislation already and what it would look like. Or if they're creating a new government agency organization, they've already created the organizational charts, the budgets, where the offices will be. They have very finite detail considered exactly how this structure will be set up, right? They're just looking for a problem big enough to happen in the country so that a policy window opens where some decision needs to be made and they can insert their decision in the middle, and they're farther ahead of everybody else who's still discussing the issue because they're showing up with a pre-constructed solution, right? Those are policy entrepreneurs. They exist in emergency management, like they exist in the firearms industry. They exist in climate adaptation. They exist in all genres, right? There are people who just want something to happen. They've convinced themselves and others that they're right, and this is the appropriate solution. So we want to be careful of those. We want to be careful also of assuming that a government program will fix our problems, assuming that if we just created more government and created more government programmatic interventions, so basically more taxpayer money sent on something, it gets better, right? There's a correlation belief, the more money you spend, the better the outcome will be. And I don't know anybody, I know of anybody who's pressed Poli-Sci 101 or Economics 101 will tell you the quality and the quality of money does not equate to a positive outcome. We have spent hundreds and hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in this country on totally useless programs that were expertly and perfectly defined, right? Probably because they answered the wrong question. And this is the heart of what I'm going to try to get at this week at SEPSA, as we call it, here in the city of Ottawa, is let's make sure that we're answering the correct question or agreeing upon the question that we are answering. Like, for example, does Canada need a civilian disaster response force or agency? Well, that's a great question, and we could probably debate that, but why would you ask the question in the first place? I'm here to ask the question, what is the problem we are trying to solve? What has happened in previous disaster responses in Canada that creates an opening that we feel needs to be addressed? So what is the very specific problem we are trying to identify? Now, the problem could be defined as municipalities and therefore the provinces have a sharp demand for unskilled and skilled labor and heavy equipment that comes on with very short notice, and we don't have that currently existed and trained in our government or in our military, which we'll get to in a second here. So we need to create that ready to go so that when an emergency happens, we have that surge workforce capability to come in and address immediate needs on the ground. So if the question is we need that immediate, then we're not saying we need a civilian disaster response force. We're saying we need a rapidly available skilled and unskilled workforce with heavy equipment to be deployed or resident in the immediate area of the disaster that can be leveraged to support operations. Okay, if we can agree upon that, then we can look at an options analysis and look at the different ways of addressing and solving the lack of surge labor. A civilian disaster response agency at that time then becomes an option, and we can understand and evaluate it against the other options that exist to solve it, right? But to ask whether we should or should not have a civilian disaster response agency presumes there is a need out there that needs to be addressed that might be solved by that, because otherwise we are trying to introduce a policy entrepreneurial solution to a problem that really doesn't exist. And we'll end up with another big arse piece of government bureaucracy without not really contributing to better post-event outcomes, right? If what we're trying to do is create a greater level of preparedness in the population so that when a disaster happens, we see less demand on the government services, okay, now we've got this need to increase demand or increase preparedness, which, let's be honest, again, I'll go back to Brock Long's phrase that we need a culture of preparedness in the country. Okay, that addresses the question, the shortfall that we've identified. So now, how do we create a culture of preparedness in Canada, in our citizens? How do we encourage people to understand that it is their responsibility? When I mean their, I don't mean them as an individual. It begins with an individual, but it goes collectively as a society, as a community. It is a community's responsibility to rise up and intervene in a disaster, not the government's. And that the government, as Damon Coppola could say, might be there as a redundancy if the requirement exceeds the capacity of the community. But right now, we're not even trying the community. We're immediately going to government, which is why the current military model in Canada works so well for the provinces, because as of now, the military is a reasonably rapidly deployable, well-disciplined, self-contained force that can provide you skilled and unskilled labor with a certain amount of heavy equipment that can be brought to bear. And it's free. Right now, it doesn't cost our premiers and our territorial leaders any money to call in the military. So if I told you as the premier, you could look really good by calling in the Army, and you could stand there and have a whole bunch of cool news conferences in front of soldiers, and that you could be photographed getting a briefing over a map by a bunch of soldiers, and that would be great PR for you, and all of this comes free of charge, everybody's pressing the easy button 10 out of 10. There's no other reason I can understand why. There's no incentive right now for a province or territory or the nation, for example, to look at providing an internal response capability in excess of incident response, which is your police, fire, and EMS, creating something above police, fire, and EMS in the community to deal with disasters and emergencies. There's no incentive to do so when a pre-cookie cutter solution is available free of charge, right? Now, the global reality is that probably in the next couple of years, Canada will be in the middle or in the final stages of preparation for a global fight. We're returning to peer or near-peer combat operations, and so the Canadian military is going to have to really double down on their training for full spectrum combat operations. They simply won't have time to worry about your sandbags or your flooded streets because they're going to be doing the sole responsibility they exist for. That's the military. That's why the military gets called, and a lot of great reasons why it shouldn't. And that's what I'm doing tomorrow in a day-long conference to figure out. We're looking at the question of how can we position the provinces and territories to be better suited to respond and within their own resources to the needs that are currently filled by the Canadian Armed Forces through something called a request for assistance framework. So we want to reduce the RFAs that come into the military, and we want the RFAs to be very specific. Now, there will always be a certain set of capabilities that intelligently reside in the military, and they don't make any intelligence to double them or recreate them in the civilian model. One is strategic airlift, right? Canada has 5 C-17s in the Royal Canadian Air Force. I know from my American friends that's a bit of a joke, but that's the extent of our strategic lift. We have a dozen or so Hercules that are up and running. So divide that by 3. That'll tell you about how many aircraft are available at any one time. It doesn't make any sense for the government of Ontario to start its own Air Force to deal with disasters, right? Okay, fair enough. That makes sense. When you're looking at surveillance capability, that's intelligently belongs in the military or in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. You have certain anti-terrorist operations that are done by the Royal Canadian Air Force along with Canadian Special Operations Forces Command to intervene into anti-terrorist operations. Those things are intelligent. But if you're looking for 800 people to fill sandbags or 800 people to dig some forest trenches, or you're looking for 800 people to bail out home basements, then obviously the military is not an intelligent answer to that. It's the easy button right now because it's free and it looks good, but it's logically not. So when we look at an options analysis, Canada's really at an interesting point here because we're all becoming aware that we need to adapt to a changing climate. I'm going to leave the fight against climate change and those ridiculous monk ears off to the side. But our climate is changing, and we're going to have to learn to adapt to it. As well, we had an uprise in the realization that disasters are becoming exceptionally more expensive. They're not more frequent, and they're not more severe. The data does not show that, but they are exponentially more expensive. Because of the fact that, as my saying goes, we continue to build expensive things and put them in precarious locations, right? So insurance is becoming very difficult to have. We have to stop losing so much societal value every time we have a disaster. So how do we do that? So we see the rise of awareness. Now, we haven't seen a change in preparedness rates in this country, but we see awareness is coming up that this opportunity exists. And I'm really hoping in the next 3 days in Ottawa at this convention, with all these minds together, that we'll be able to sit down and say, hey, there are going to be quite a number of different options and ideas that people come up with, right? This is only successful. Now, if we want to put my academic hat on, this is only successful when you have a whole of society approach. So you can only do this if everybody's at the table. That means civil society, which represents the people, the residents, the human beings, us. You have the private sector, so the corporate sector, from your corner store to your multi-billion-dollar corporation, they are residents in the community. and it can't be successful without them. You have to have the public sector. Obviously, the government needs to be involved. It has emergency management agencies. It can be part of the solution as well. And then you have the not-for-profit sector, which is all of your community organizations from your neighborhood association up to the Salvation Army, United Way, Red Cross, etc. All of those spheres, those 4 spheres, are present to some extent in every organized community in the world. They all need to be present at the table and representative and have a voice. If we want to solve this as a community, if we want to first identify what we're really short on and then go through an options analysis and have an honest, frank discussion as within our current framework of resources, because there is no more money coming for anybody in the upcoming constrained spending and the increased defense spending that's coming due to the approaching global conflict. There's not going to be any future interventions, injections of large amount of cash from taxpayers into emergency management. So how do we involve the whole of society? How do we bring all of the skills, capabilities, and assets that exist together in a consensus collaboration coordination model to where we can design, where I live in the city of Ottawa, what does the city of Ottawa response look like? And does it have to look like Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, St. John's, Chilliwack, Yellowknife, or should it reflect the local concerns, the local issues, the local hazards, and how the local community wants to execute it? Not a system imposed on them, but how the local community would like and prefer to build their response force, right? That, I think, is the recipe that will bring us forward. That, I think, is an incredible opportunity to sit down and say, okay, we realize that these damages are only going to get more expensive, and it's going to cost all of us more. It's going to inconvenience more, let alone all the other things that could happen in the cyber domain and other domains that can intervene in our lives. A good friend of mine and a really smart individual once said that Canada is utterly and woefully unprepared for any significant event to happen. And I couldn't, that is an utterly true statement in today's world. The best way to phrase it. It's an utterly true. Our country and the population is absolutely unprepared for the calamities that may be coming in the latter half of the 2020s. And we need to do something to change that. Yelling at people, telling them to build emergency kits in their house, none of that has anything to do with better post-event outcomes. None of that has anything to do with improving the human condition or improving the likelihood that people will be able to navigate exogenous shocks within their own resources, within their community's resources, and then emerge on the other side back to their normal state as quickly as possible, right? That's our goal. I phrase it as our goal in emergency management should be better post-event outcomes. And through a culture of preparedness, you get yourself and your family to a position where almost irrespective of what happens, you have very little impact and very little disruption in how you conduct normal affairs. And if there's an impact, you're able to fix that in a very short order and get back to conducting normal operations as soon as possible. You and your community together are ready to handle it, and it's not relying on government intervention, right? Every time something happens. The problem with that is we create outsized expectations on what the government can do. And we see that now when you interview people about emergency management, you interview people who are experiencing a disaster and what they believe the government should be able to do and what they want the government to do for them is so incredibly exponentially larger than anything the government ever could do, but we've never done anything to counter that. We've never done anything to bring people's expectations down to reality. And statements such as, hey, folks, this is what we can do for you. But at this point here, at this reasonably exact point that we're pretty sure we know, you're going to be on your own. And it doesn't matter what you're suffering. It doesn't matter who's hurt. And it doesn't matter the harm or threat you're under. At this point, you're going to be on your own because there's nothing more we can do to help you. That honesty breeds integrity. That builds institutional trust when you are frank and honest with people. But if people simply believe that emergency management will save the day every day, on time, on target, in these outsized expectations, what you have is people saying, the system failed me. No, the system didn't fail you. The system in Canada has worked brilliantly. There's always growing pains, but the system in Canada has worked brilliantly. The problem we have in our country, if we have exceptionally outsized expectations for what emergency management can do within the resources allocated, and resources are real, folks. Every time the cabinet table sits down, emergency management goes up against childcare, dental care, health care, education, and all the other social ills. It'll lose every time, and it does lose every time. There is no large-scale investment coming, and I would argue there's no rationale for any large-scale investment coming in the choices that you would have to make, right? I can't look at somebody in the face and say, I need $40 billion intervention in a mitigation, and I'm taking it out of the healthcare budget. Your answer is no. You don't get elected as a politician, and the people will tell you to pound salt. And because we can't create any more money, that horse is out of the barn. If you want an extra $100 million in emergency management, I want to know where you're getting that money from, right? Because it has to come out of somewhere else. We're not in a position to create new resources for the government. And this isn't a political speech. It's the reality. I don't care who's in government because it changes. This is the same thing that's happening at municipal governments, right? Municipal governments in the province of Ontario, where I live, are mandated, all 444, to have a certain bylaw written about emergency preparedness and emergency management. They have to have certain capabilities that are existing, and they're not funded to do these. These are mandated to the 444 municipalities by the provincial government and the ministry, and there's a regulation that outlines exactly what they have to do, right? These costs are imposed on them. They have to take that money to create that emergency management office and minimal acceptable standard out of the general revenue, put it in there, which means it's not available for priorities at the municipal level like garbage collecting, social services, affordable housing, right? I mean, you ask somebody, I want to increase the mitigation budget in the city of Ottawa, but I'm taking the money for fund that because cities can't run debt. So the money for that has to come out of where? I'm going to take it out of affordable housing. I just look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself how long that's going to be successful. That's the reality of resources. So I'm really hoping as we get together over the next 3 days that we have some great discourse. We're going to disagree, and I think that's the brilliance of what we have to learn to do again. Right? When you in a discussion with somebody, it's not and I'll give you my frame. I'll give you my viewpoint on this. It's not my job to prove somebody wrong, nor is it my job to prove myself right. My goal in a debate or discussion on an issue is not to win. It's to present the logic behind what I say I think is a reasonable solution to a clearly identified problem, and then be able to defend that when people have questions, right? I don't need to come out the winner. It's not about here to defeat somebody else's argument. And I think that's the sense we're going in now. And I see that hostility coming out on LinkedIn where a lot of people are trying to win. Instead of the win being just the discourse alone. Sitting back and listening to ideas you may not agree with or you might not have heard before, and taking the time to listen to what the individual has to say and to consider it, right? Remember, how many people can sit down and listen to somebody who has an opposing view, spew on about it for 3 minutes, and sit there staring at them, listening, and keep their mouth shut? Oh, that's a talent most people don't have. They're listening to figure out ways to defeat your argument and win the day instead of listening to what the other person has to say. It's unfortunately the reality, and emergency management is no different than other sectors that have the same level of problems. So, if you're in Ottawa over the conference, drop down and see me. I will be all over the Shaw Centre having a look around. I appreciate it if you come up and say hi. If you're not there, look at the emergencyexpo.com, which is the website, at some of the outcomes and some of the panels, and then hopefully we'll be able to address some questions. If you have any questions you'd love for me to ask people and representative of all of their organizations and industries that are going to be there, drop me an email. Jump over to www.insidemycanoehead.ca. There's contact down at the bottom with my email address. There's everything you need to know about the podcast there as well. And to just spread the word. And that's the one thing I have to ask. If you appreciate today's content and if you appreciate the content we made up to date, I would ask that you just share a friend. Tell somebody about us. Share the word, as I like to say. This podcast is free. It always will be free. There's no ads on it. Everything that's done in this podcast is to provide non-apocalyptic, evidence-based preparedness education for rational people, right? Society is not falling, though the 2020s are going to be exceptionally spicy. So what does a reasonable, normal human being living in an urban or suburban environment who just wants to rock an incredible life and chase their dreams, what do they need to do to wrap themselves in a blanket of insulation so when the dumb, idiotic crazies of the world step up and do something, the harm or the impact to you is nominal or minimal at best and you bounce back immediately? That's what we do, free of charge. Take care, stay safe,